Welcome to the History Politics Podcast, Putting the Past to Work from UCLA's Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, I'm David Myers, and welcome to the History Politics Podcast, Putting the Past to Work. I'm delighted to host for today's episode Luwei Ying, Assistant Professor of Political Science at UCLA. Luwei was the co-author, along with David Carter and Sadaf Vafa, of a paper, Historical Border Instability and the Rise of Populism, that was supported by a Luskin Center grant. The resurgence of populism as a powerful force on today's political landscape, from South Asia to Europe to the United States, has attracted the attention of many scholars and observers. What explains its allure in so many different contemporary settings? Luwei Ying and her colleagues have focused on one interesting and intuitive factor to help explain its rise: border instability. Our conversation examines this finding in all of its historical depth, as well as a series of policy recommendations that the research team has proposed, including strengthening governance at the local level and fortifying history education. Welcome to Putting the Past to Work, Luwei.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. So can you tell us how you came to this topic, which was the subject of your report, Historical Border Instability and the Rise of Populism? What was the problem you saw that you thought needed more research?
Sure. We are political scientists who study international politics and institutions. And in that world, borders are arguably the most important institution there is. They define which government has authority, who counts as a citizen, and how states build power over territory. So at the beginning, we were simply fascinated by borders themselves, how they change when they move, and how those changes shape the process of state building historically. Initially, I thought the story might end there. I assume we were studying something that belonged mostly to the past, how states consolidated authority centuries ago, and how borders disrupted or supported that process. I felt like a classic historical project. However, as we dug deeper into the data and began connecting these historical patterns to contemporary outcomes, we started to see something much, much bigger. These old episodes of border instabilities weren't just dusty historical facts. They were actually showing up in today's politics. When we map regions that experienced repeated border changes and compared them to modern voting patterns and attitudes, we literally saw these historical disruptions helping explain where people are more skeptical of government, where trust is weaker, where populist movements tend to resonate more strongly. So
right. Okay. So we're going to get to that correlation to the present, but I want to just go back to one of your opening definitional statements about borders being a unit of measurement of great interest to political scientists, because I, who am not a political scientist, would say, well, probably states would be the basic unit of measurement or the site of greatest interest for political scientists. Why not states? Or are borders sort of the necessary precondition for state-based sovereignty? Why borders per se?
Yeah, so that's literally two sides of the same coin. How do you define a state? Well, you have to define the borders, right? So when I say borders, I broadly mean territory. I broadly mean the states. And that's why I emphasized the important role of borders in state building.
Right. So what actual border disputes first caught your attention? Or, I mean, were you drawn to the abstract principle of border instability, or were there actual historical cases that really captured your attention? I mean, if you were to ask me about border instability, I would think of France and Germany over the course of the 19th and 20th century. I would think of other sites in East Central Europe. Was there a specific case or series of cases that drew your attention to this? what was it actually that really got you onto border instability?
Yeah. So a few places really jump out. And we often learn from the cases first and then try to see the patterns. So you've already mentioned some very interesting ones, like the northeastern France and Alsace. These are very classic examples. This is a region that has been pulled back and forth between French and German rule over centuries. So when we see sovereignty changes like that, it's not just symbolic. It affects who runs the courts, what language officials use, whose laws apply, and how it feels like to live in a place like that. There are, of course, other examples. Uh, Again, I would say Poland. That's a very prominent one. If you think about the history where half of the nation, half of the communities were uh, suddenly found themselves under different states almost overnight. Uh, well, people lived through that repeated cycle of new rulers, new rules, and new systems. There are tons of examples like that. And I do have to say that this paper mostly draw evidence from Europe, mainly because Europe gives us unusually fine-grained historical and electoral data that allows us to do this kind of quantitative analysis. But I very much see the underlying logic as well as more universal. So the story is not Europe is special. It's whatever borders have shifted repeatedly and state authority has been unstable. So we can find communities with long-term skepticism about government effectiveness around the world. And we are particularly likely to find communities like that when we see that communities experienced border changes historically around the
Mhm.
world.
Mhm. So if you were to continue this study, where would you like to go next?
Oh, good question. So, uh, I can think about many regions. I guess one example would be South Asia after the partition of India and Pakistan in, I guess, 1947.
Mhm.
The border didn't just move. Millions of people were uprooted, communities were divided, and entire regions had to rebuild political authority and the new states. That left long-standing legacies of displacement, mistrust, uneven governance, and of course, research opportunities for us. And then I
And
would
by similar logic, would Israel-Palestine qualify another instance of partition? Does that satisfy some of the criteria that were of interest to you?
Yes, absolutely. I was actually just about to talk about the Middle East. That's a very prominent example as well. And actually, not only Israel, Palestine, like in the Middle East, generally, we see a lot of borders being drawn and redrawn during the colonial and post-imperial periods. And that has a lot of legacies long after the border shifts.
So I want to talk about that, imperial legacies, because one of the effects of the dismantling of world empires in the midst of and in the immediate aftermath of the First World War was the creation of successor states that really created not just new borders, but new national identities for millions and millions of people. And it inspires one to engage in that act of sentimental nostalgia for the grand old era of empires. So I'm wondering if your model of border instability really explores cases that emerge out of the First World War or extends into the great age of global empires of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. How does that border instability look like in the great age of empire?
Yeah, so first of all, the World War One is definitely one of the most dramatic moments because borders changed fast and the stakes are huge. So you're absolutely right to highlight that milestone. But our argument is a little more stubborn than World War One caused this whole thing. What we're saying is the long run accumulation matters. Some places have been on the frontier of shifting authority for centuries, long before, say, 1980. And that long experience shapes how local state building unfolds over time. And what's really striking in our research is just how far back this pattern goes. Our historical border data reaches all the way to around 1200. And we still see these effects echoing forward all the way into the present. That means the timeline isn't just the world wars. It stretches across major turning points in European political history. That includes, for example, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, when modern states' borders and sovereignty really began to harden, or the French Revolution in 1789, which transformed ideas about citizenship and the states. We usually think about these moments as reset points, but we see regions that had long histories of border changes continued to carry those legacies of disrupted governance through these milestones.
So, do you think, just to go back to the aftermath of the First World War, I very much appreciate that longue durée perspective, but just trying to think of some of the correlations that you're trying to draw out as you did in the study, do you think that we can explain border instability as a chief driver of those ideological aberrations or perhaps not so aberrant phenomena that emerged in the 1920s, like fascism and Nazism? Your report studies the correlation between border instability and populism as it manifests itself today. But I'm wondering about these other cases of extreme ideologies, ideological movements.
Well, that's such a great question because that question gets at what kind of politics border instability might generate.
Right.
I would put it this way. Border instability is not a fascism machine. It's more like a long-run factory for anti-establishment receptivity, a tendency to believe that mainstream elites and institutions don't deliver. What that receptivity attaches to depends on the era and what options exist. In the interwar period, in some contexts, that could contribute to openness to authoritarian movements. Well, in post 1945 Europe, where elections are the primary arena, this often shows up as higher support for populist parties, which campaign on the slogans like the system is rigged, the elites failed, we'll fix it. So I would say border instability is a deeper condition. Populism or authoritarianism is one possible expression, depending on the political manual available to that country at that point.
Right. So the correlation, therefore, is between border instability and resentment toward elites. And part of that, as you say in the report, is because of the inability of governing regimes to engage in any kind of long-term investment or infrastructural building that would provide a sense of stability. Is that the argument?
Yes, I would call it the key mechanism.
So you can't have stable governmental functions when you have border instability.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's not it's not like black and white. So if you have unstable borders historically, you are having a much more harder you will have a harder time in building these state institutions. If you had that in history, you would have to put in more efforts.
Mhm. Okay, so I want to just put forward a kind of countervailing proposition
Yeah.
that arose while reading your report, which would suggest that border permeability, which I kind of am equating with border instability, so therein lies the first flaw in my logic, but border permeability, open borders, can allow for a degree of cultural integration or exposure to different kinds of um, groups of people in ways that may increase levels of tolerance. based on sort of the old principles of contact theory, whereby exposure to the other is a conditioning agent that mitigates xenophobia and hate and other forms of discrimination. The countervailing view is that border instability induces a kind of anxiety and resentment towards elites and a sense of longing for greater stability. So I wonder how you assess these two ways of understanding um, border instability. And in the first instance, I should just clarify again that I mean border permeability that allows for the passage of people back and forth, whereby they have the opportunity to encounter people whom they otherwise would not.
Yeah, I think the key is to separate two different things that may sound similar. The first is border permeability. Can people cross, trade, interact? And the second is border instability. Does sovereignty keep switching? New rulers, new institutions, new laws.
Mhm.
So I think what you said about contact theory is mostly about permeability and interaction. Well,
Right.
our paper is about instability of authority, and those can move in opposite directions. We can think about Europe. So today, EU has a very stable border, but it is very permeable, meaning that you can easily drive across borders and contact and cooperate.
Mhm.
But when borders change, what gets disrupted is the slow work of governance, bureaucracies, legal predictability, long-term investment, accountability change. It's hard to invest in public goods if you don't know who will be in charge in 10 or 20 years, or if the incentives are to extract quickly before authority shifts again. So I would say the big picture is not stable border good, open border bad. It's stable authority helps build institutions. Openness can be great when institutions are stable enough to manage it.
That's a very helpful distinction. So what the paper does is basically make the claim that there is a correlation between border instability and populism. And we've talked a little bit about how border instability might or might not be a driver of other forms of extreme ideological movements. But I have to say, when I think of populism in its current incarnation, I often think of it as, especially in its ethnocentric variant, as a reaction to globalization and the kind of broad sweeping claims of globalization, and for that matter, the economic effects thereof. So you're not making a totalizing argument for this is the only way to understand populism, but I wonder how globalization figures into your thinking, if at all.
Yeah, I would say globalization is clearly a major trigger in the modern populist wave. Trade shocks, migration, culture change. What we are seeing here is that globalization doesn't hit a blank slate. It hits places with histories. Our evidence suggests that economic variables like GDP and employment don't fully explain the relationship. We still see an effect of historical border instability after accounting for all these variables. So here's an intuitive way to put it. Globalization is the storm. Historical border instability is whether your house was built with solid foundations. So two towns can face the same storm, but if one has a long legacy of weak governance, roads, services, local administrative capacities, trust, people there are more likely to say, oh, of course, the government messed this up again. And that's exactly the emotional fuels populists use.
Right. So when I think of the classic site of your thesis, where you have border instability historically and very unmistakable forms of populism, I think of Hungary under Viktor Orban. I think of sort of the populist politics, which he has called illiberal democracy. And I think of the long history of border instability, certainly in the wake of the First World War, the Treaty of Trianon, 1940, 1944, but even before then. I'm wondering if you were drawn to Hungary as well, or if I'm sort of understanding the variables in play. as you had intended them?
Yeah, for sure. Hungary is a very intuitive case to talk through. What our framework suggests is not Hungary become populist because of this one treaty. It's that in places where longer history of disrupted state building, people can develop a durable skepticism toward the establishment, toward whether liberal institutions actually deliver. And leaders like Orban are very skilled at converting that kind of skepticism into a political story, the people versus corrupt elites, plus often a narrative about external interference, Brussels, migrants, global capital. So yes, Hungary is a case where the historical foundations story line up perfectly with our story. And it becomes a case very easy to see the relationship of the two variables we are studying here.
So let's move to another case where we see skepticism toward elites. Indeed, that has boiled over into a quite hardcore resentment that has led to very significant forms of populist politics, and that is the United States. How are we to understand Trumpian style populism? We have one of the variables, but perhaps not the other. I'm just sort of curious whether you think your study sheds any light on the case of the United States in the 21st century.
Yeah, United States. I would say broadly, uh, the theory applies here as well, but with a very important twist. In Europe, we're measuring centuries of border changes in a dense historical map of shifting sovereignty. Well, in the United States, we didn't see it. Borders have been more stable in the modern era, but the United States absolutely has frontier histories, contested incorporation, and internal governance legacies that can create similar dynamics of the state didn't build effectively here, or the state wasn't legitimate here. So I would frame it like this. The mechanism travels even if the historical source look a little bit different. The mechanism here is long run experiences that teach communities that government is ineffective or unresponsive. That leads to a result, which is anti establishment politics becomes more appealing.
So, where in your model is a factor that seems so prominent in present day populism, which is population movement and particularly the movement of immigrants? There's so much anti-immigrant rhetoric that seems to be a driver of a populist politics. But that factor is not present, or at least explicitly mentioned in your report. So I'm just wondering where you think that fits into the model, if at all.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned anti-immigration uh, sentiment because it literally connects the metaphorical border and literal border here. Uh, anti-immigrant anti-immigrant politics often treats the border as a symbol of control. So if you can't control the border, you can't control anything. That's their logic. So when people already believe institutions are ineffective, immigration can become the most visible proof that elites have lost control. In our language, immigration can be a contemporary trigger, but it resonates more when the baseline belief is the state doesn't deliver. That's why border rhetoric is so powerful. It's about competence and sovereignty, not only culture.
Okay, so you've described very compellingly the correlation between border instability and populism. The question that remains for us to answer is what to do about it. You offer a series of recommendations in the report, and I wonder if you could share some of them with our listeners.
Yeah, I would say the good news is the policy takeaway is surprisingly hopeful. So in our paper, we have presented some survey evidence, and they suggest people in historically unstable areas are not necessarily rejecting democracy as an ideal. They're just saying democracy isn't working in practice. So that's great. The response shouldn't just be defend democratic values in the abstract. It should be make government work better where trust has been historically hardest to build. So
Can I
that's
pause
very clear.
there and just ask you, I want to return to recommendation, but do you think the same about the current democracy crisis in the United States, that the crisis is not necessarily one of a complete abandonment of faith, but a crisis about people's expectations about what can be delivered through democratic institutions?
Yes, that's my belief at least.
So
So
you're not an arch alarmist in that regard, as, for example, I might be.
well, I'm a little bit more optimistic than you. I would say we are seeing a lot of evidence in the United States that people still believe democracy is great, and they want to hold on to the democratic ideal, but they differ in how to achieve that. They differ in approaches, and they have different opinions on what should be changed in their society.
Okay, tell us about some of the other recommendations that emerge.
Yeah, sure. So I actually listed a bunch of them in the report, but I want to highlight four of them. One is strengthen local governance capacity. Basically, I mean, invest in local public services and administrative capacity, especially in places where the state historically underinvested. If the core complaint is you never showed up for us, the answer has to be show up reliably. The second is place-based economic integration, not just general growth policy, but targeted infrastructure and reskilling tied to real local industries. So communities feel plugged into the national economy, not left behind. The third would be community engagement and participatory governance. Give people visible local channels to shape decisions, participating in budgeting, advisory councils, or accountability, and show them that accountability is not a slogan, it's experienced. And finally, historical education and narrative repair. I know this sounds very soft, but it really, really matters. If distrust is inherited across generations, then helping communities understand their own history, why governance is fragmented, why identities are complicated, can reduce the temptation to accept simplistic scope-gate stories.
To read more about this very interesting subject and to get a deeper exposure to the recommendations offered, I encourage everybody to read this paper, Historical Border Instability and the Rise of Populism, which can be found on the website of the Luskin Center for History and Policy. And I'd like to thank one of its co-authors, Luwei Ying, for a really fascinating conversation. It's been great to talk to you, Luwei.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the History Politics podcast, Putting the Past to Work, from UCLA's Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.